He bought an abandoned church for $10, a price so low it almost felt like a warning. The locals said no one stayed there long, but no one told him why. When Samuel Hayes, a battle-worn veteran, stepped through those broken doors with his loyal dog, Ranger, he thought he was just buying shelter from the cold. But the first night, Ranger froze, ears raised, staring at the altar. Something beneath the floorboards was calling to them. What they found there wasn't gold, and it wasn't ghosts. It was the truth this town had buried, and the faith it had forgotten. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of courage, faith, and second chances. The last days of winter lingered over Willow Creek, like a breath that refused to fade. Frost glistened on the fences, and a pale sun pressed weakly through the clouds. The world smelled of pine smoke and cold iron, quiet, watchful, waiting for spring. Samuel Hayes, 48, walked the shoulder of the county road with the steadiness of someone who had learned to keep moving no matter how heavy the miles. Broad-shouldered but lean, his frame carried the memory of discipline. His beard, trimmed close, was touched with silver. His eyes, amber and weary, belonged to a man who had seen both the beginning and the end of things. Years ago, in Iraq, Samuel had been a combat medic. He had learned how to stop bleeding, but not how to stop remembering. Beside him moved Ranger, a German shepherd with a dark sable coat, and a scar above one ear from his K9 rescue days. At 5 years old, he was strong, alert, and loyal beyond reason. Where Samuel hesitated, Ranger listened. Where Samuel doubted, Ranger stood. Together they made a pair that looked both lost and complete. They had reached Willow Creek by accident after Samuel's old pickup gave out 10 miles south. For 3 nights he had slept behind a boarded gas station, sharing scraps and silence with the dog. He wasn't chasing a destination, just distance from the noise in his own head. That morning, a sheet of yellowed paper on the window of Jenkins' General Store caught his eye. For sale. Old Willow Hill Church. Tender's property as is. $10. The price was so absurd it felt like a dare. Samuel stood there a moment, snow melting in his beard, before stepping inside the store. The bell chimed. Warmth rushed over him, along with the scent of coffee and pine soap. Behind the counter stood Clara Jenkins, late 50s, gray blonde hair tucked under a knitted cap. Her face carried the kind lines of someone who had smiled through hard winters. "You look half frozen," she said, pouring coffee before he asked. "On the house. Strangers with frost on their beards get mercy first." Samuel accepted the cup, steam fogging his lashes. "Appreciate it. What brings you this far north?" "Passing through," he said. "Saw the paper about the old church." Her hand paused. The spoon in her mug stopped clinking. "That place?" She sighed. "It's been empty 50 years. Some say the roof leaks, others say the walls listen. Nobody stays." "Maybe I'm nobody," Samuel replied with a dry smile. Clara studied him, the frayed coat, the strong hands, the silence behind his voice. "You've seen worse than cold wood," she said softly. "Still, be careful. That hill keeps secrets better than most people." He nodded, left $1 on the counter despite her protest, and walked out. Ranger waited by the door, tail brushing the snow. That night, Samuel lay awake by the dying fire, thinking of that poster. $10. He could hardly buy a meal for that. Yet the idea of the church tugged at him like a quiet pulse. Maybe it was shelter. Maybe it was something to fix besides himself. When dawn came pale and brittle, he had already decided. At the county records office, a thin clerk named Tom Voss handled the deed. The man's narrow face looked older than his years, eyes shifting whenever Samuel mentioned Willow Hill. "You understand? The county isn't liable," Voss said, sliding papers across the counter. "The structure's unsafe, been abandoned since 1972. Samuel noticed the man's fingers tremble as he adjusted his glasses. People still talk about that year? Tom forced a smile. Not much worth remembering. Samuel signed, his handwriting deliberate. Then, I guess it's mine now. Outside, wind swept fine snow across the road as he and Ranger started up the narrow path toward Willow Hill. The trail wound between skeletal maples and stone fences furred with moss. Each step felt like crossing from the living world into a memory. The church stood waiting at the crest, its steeple crooked, its cross tilted as if in shame. Paint peeled from the boards in long gray ribbons. The stained glass windows had lost their color, yet, even in ruin, it had presence, a quiet dignity that refused to die. Samuel laid a gloved hand on the door. The hinges groaned and surrendered. Inside, the air was stale, but still carried a faint echo of hymn smoke and candle wax. Pews stood in uneven lines, one toppled on its side. The altar at the far end was draped in dust. Ranger padded ahead, sniffing. His claws clicked softly, tail low. Samuel walked the aisle, fingers trailing the backs of pews. "Looks like you and me, partner," he said. "Home sweet home." Ranger gave a low huff and sat by the entrance, ever the sentinel. When night fell, Samuel lit a small fire in a tin bucket near the altar. The glow painted moving shapes across the walls, shadows that almost looked like people listening. He sipped instant soup, the cheap salt and heat filling the hollow space in his stomach. He looked around and whispered, "Could be worse." But the silence after his words felt alive, as if the church was waiting for something to be said. Lying back, he remembered the desert, the metallic air, the screams that still lived in echoes. He thought of Corporal Lewis, his best friend, who had died in his arms years ago. Samuel had carried that failure longer than any wound. Perhaps that was why he had come here, not for shelter from winter, but from memory. A faint sound broke the stillness. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked. The noise came again, a creak beneath the altar, soft but deliberate. Samuel sat up, heartbeat thudding. "It's just the wood settling," he said quietly, though he didn't believe it. Ranger didn't move. Samuel approached the altar, knelt, and placed his palm on the floor. The wood felt colder than the rest, dense, untouched. He straightened, uneasy. "Old buildings make strange music," he murmured. Ranger's gaze didn't waver. He smiled faintly. "Tomorrow we'll see about that roof, huh?" Ranger circled once and lay down, though one ear stayed raised. Samuel fed the fire a last scrap of wood and stretched out beside him. Through a gap in the roof, a single star flickered above the leaning cross. For the first time in years, his mind went still. He dreamed of walking the same road again. Only now the church bells were ringing, not with fear, but with promise. And as dawn crept through the broken window, snow falling in slow silver flakes, the town below whispered about the veteran who had bought the church on Willow Hill for $10. Some called him foolish. Others called him brave. Samuel never heard a word of it. He slept deeply, his hand resting on Ranger's fur, while the old church, long abandoned, breathed for the first time in half a century. Morning sunlight slipped weakly through the cracked stained glass windows, painting fractured colors on the dusty floorboards. The fire from the night before had died, leaving behind a pale circle of ash. Samuel Hayes stirred awake, stiff from the hard floor, and for a moment forgot where he was. Then the smell of old timber and the soft rhythm of Ranger's breathing reminded him. He had bought a church for $10. The air felt different that morning, quiet, thick, and listening. Samuel rose, brushed snow from his coat, and stretched the stiffness from his limbs. "All right, boy," he said, voice hoarse with sleep. "Let's see what $10 bought us." Ranger stood, shook himself, and followed as Samuel pushed the heavy doors open. A gust of cold wind swept inside, carrying the scent of pine and wet rust. Outside, The hill was wrapped in mist, and the world below had disappeared. Somewhere far away, a bell, one that still worked, chimed 8 slow times. They began cleaning. Samuel gathered fallen hymn books, broken glass, and pieces of wax, piling them near the front steps. Each creak beneath his boots sounded alive, like breath caught in the ribs of the church itself. Ranger worked his own way, nose low, tail steady, disciplined and silent, like the soldier he once was. By midday, Samuel's sleeves were rolled up, dust clinging to his arms and face. When he paused to drink from his canteen, something caught his eye on the far wall, faint grooves beneath the grime. He knelt and wiped it clean with his sleeve. Letters appeared, carved deep into the wood. "Forgive us, Father." He traced the words slowly, fingers trembling. Beneath them ran a series of names, dozens, maybe more, etched in haste, letters uneven, some cut short as though the hands had shaken. Ranger stood close, eyes fixed. "You see it too," Samuel murmured. "What did they want forgiveness for?" One name caught his attention. Michael Voss. His mind flickered to Tom Voss, the nervous clerk from the county office. Maybe family, maybe not. Ranger barked once, sharp and alert. He was pawing near the altar now, nose pressed to the cracked floorboards. Samuel crouched beside him and brushed away dust. Something hard lay beneath. A weathered Bible, the leather cover dry as bone. When he opened it, the pages flaked apart like old leaves. Between the pages rested a folded note, browned and fragile. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate. "If anyone finds this, return the voice to Willow Creek. The bell must ring again." Samuel read the words twice, then looked up toward the steeple through the ceiling gap. The tower had long collapsed inward. The bell rope hung, frayed and broken, like a forgotten thread of prayer. He tucked the note carefully into his pocket. "Looks like someone left us a mission," he said to Ranger. By afternoon, snow had melted enough for them to explore outside. Behind the church stretched a small graveyard, the stones leaning under moss and time. Most names were gone to weather, but one still caught the light. Father Michael. Samuel removed his cap, his voice soft. "Guess you're still preaching from up here." As he turned, a voice came from the path behind him. "Not many people talk to the dead around here." He turned to see a woman, tall, graceful, mid-40s perhaps, wrapped in a brown wool coat. Her auburn hair was tied neatly back, streaked with silver that shone when the light caught it. Her face bore quiet strength, the kind shaped by both loss and endurance. "You must be the man who bought the old church," she said. "That obvious? In Willow Creek, nothing stays secret long." She stepped closer, smiling faintly. "I'm Sarah Whitmore. I run the inn by the creek. Folks thought you might need something warm to eat." She handed him a wicker basket filled with bread, apples, and a jar of stew. "You'll need more than courage to fix this place," she added. Samuel smiled, surprised by her kindness. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." "Just Sarah," she said. "If you're really staying, you'll hear the wind tonight. Everyone does. Don't mistake it for ghosts. It's only the church remembering." When she left, her boots left delicate prints in the snow, fading quickly under the breeze. Samuel stood watching her go until Ranger nudged his leg, reminding him the day wasn't done. As evening fell, Samuel lit a fire again, the flames flickering across the carved wall. The words, "Forgive us." Father seemed to waver in the light, as if alive. He sat with the Bible open beside him, rereading the note. "Return the voice to Willow Creek." The wind outside began to stir, pressing softly against the windows. Samuel felt the air shift before the first note rang. A single, deep chime, then another, then a third. He froze. The bell rope had been cut for decades, yet the sound rolled down the hill, solemn and strong, like a memory refusing to die. Ranger stood rigid, then lay by the door, head lifted, eyes fixed upward. Samuel whispered, "You hear that, boy?" The dog didn't move, only breathed slow and steady, as if guarding something holy. Samuel walked to the center aisle, every footstep echoing with the weight of time. The sound was not frightening. It was peaceful, almost thankful. When the last chime faded into the night, silence returned, softer now. Samuel exhaled slowly. "Maybe someone just wanted to be heard again," he said. Then, almost to himself, perhaps forgiveness was louder than silence after all. Ranger blinked once, his amber eyes glowing in the firelight. Outside, mist wrapped the hill, but inside, for the first time since he had arrived, the church no longer felt empty. It felt awake. The wind hummed through the rafters like breath in a sleeping chest. The old house of God, forgotten and wounded, had found its voice again. And as Samuel drifted into sleep, Ranger still kept watch, his gaze steady toward the tower, guarding not against danger, but for faith reborn. The morning after the bells rang, Samuel woke to a kind of quiet that felt earned, not empty. The fire had gone out, yet the air held a strange warmth. Ranger lay near the door, his head resting on his paws but eyes open, watching the sunlight creep across the pews. Samuel stretched, the ache in his shoulders easing, and walked outside. Mist still hung over Willow Hill, but it looked different now, as if the fog had learned to breathe again. Down in town, smoke curled from the chimney of Jenkins' General Store, the same place where Samuel had bought the deed. He decided to visit, both for supplies and for answers. Ranger trotted beside him, the sound of his paws soft against the thawing earth. When they arrived, the small bell above the store door chimed like an echo from another world. Clara Jenkins stood behind the counter, sorting canned goods. She was in her late 50s, her frame sturdy and kind, with laugh lines carved deep by years of weather and worry. Her gray blonde hair was tied in a loose braid, and her green eyes, though gentle, carried a shadow of things remembered too long. "Well," she said, setting down a tin of beans, "if it isn't the man who bought the church that won't die." Samuel smiled faintly. "Looks like it tried to talk last night." Her hands stilled. "You heard the bell? 3 times?" The room went quiet except for the creak of the old floorboards. Clara drew a slow breath and walked around the counter. "Sit, Mr. Hayes," she said softly. "There's something you need to hear. Been a long time coming." He followed her to a small table by the window. The morning light made her face look both older and stronger. She poured 2 cups of coffee, her hands steady now that she'd made her choice to speak. "You ever wonder," she began, "why the church sold for $10 instead of being torn down?" "I figured nobody wanted it." She shook her head. "No, son. People were afraid of it, afraid of what it remembered." She leaned back, eyes unfocused, as though staring through time. "It was 1972. The town wasn't much bigger than it is now. Back then, the church wasn't just a place to pray. It was the heart of Willow Creek. Weddings, funerals, charity drives, you name it. And at the center of it all was Father Michael O'Donnell." Samuel listened quietly. Ranger sat near his feet, tail still, ears tilted toward her voice. "Father Michael was a tall Irishman," she continued. "Late 40s, maybe. Thick brown hair, always combed back, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wasn't the sort who preached from above. He sat beside you, shared your bread, helped you rebuild your barn after a storm. The kind of man people trusted without thinking." She paused, her voice thinning. "But trust can make people blind." Samuel leaned forward. "What happened?" The town had struck a vein of gold not far from the river, enough to make everyone dream, a little too loud. The council decided to sell rights to a mining company, promising part of the profits would go to the widows and veterans still struggling after the war. Father Michael kept the records himself to make sure no one was cheated. Her hand tightened on her cup. "But greed doesn't sleep. The council, mostly men with money in their eyes, found ways to hide the gold. Fake ledgers, ghost workers, missing receipts. Michael found out, and he wouldn't stay quiet. He went straight to the papers, wrote letters to the territorial office, said the poor had been robbed by the hands that swore to serve them. Samuel's jaw tightened, and they turned on him. Faster than a wolf in hunger, Clara said. Within 3 days, new records showed up, signed in his name, claimed he'd stolen the gold himself. Every document forged, every signature perfect. The sheriff at the time, Eli Voss, father to that clerk you met, announced the investigation closed. Folks didn't know what to believe. The ones who did know, she looked out the window, her voice fading. They were warned to forget. Ranger gave a low growl, as if sensing her unease. Then, she said after a moment, Father Michael vanished. They said he ran. Others said he hanged himself in shame. No body was ever found. Only his Bible, left on the altar, open to the book of Job. The next Sunday, no one came to Mass. The Sunday after that, the doors stayed shut. The bell stopped ringing. Samuel stared at his hands. The grave behind the church. It says, Father Michael. She nodded. Someone carved it years later. Maybe to make peace. Maybe to keep people away. The clock above the counter ticked softly between them. For a while, neither spoke. Then Clara said, You remind me of him. Stubborn, quiet, won't stop digging even when the ground bites back. Samuel smiled faintly. I guess we share bad habits. You be careful, Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice firm now. The Voss family still runs half this town. Some truths don't like to be uncovered. He stood and put a few bills on the table, though she waved them off. Thanks for the coffee. Don't thank me, she said. If that bell rang, maybe it's the town asking for forgiveness. Maybe it's time we finally listen. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawing pine. Ranger trotted ahead, nose lifted as if chasing invisible trails. Samuel followed the dirt road back toward Willow Hill, Clara's words echoing in his mind. The bell stopped ringing. The day faith fell silent. When he reached the church, Sarah Whitmore was already there, standing near the front steps with her coat drawn tight. The afternoon light turned her hair to copper flame. I brought nails and timber, she said, nodding toward the bundle beside her. Can't fix a roof without help. He smiled. Didn't think I'd get volunteers this fast. I'm not volunteering, she said lightly. I'm investing in something that matters. Together they patched the lower windows, working in silence except for the scrape of wood and the sound of rangers sniffing through fallen pews. Occasionally, Sarah glanced at the carved words on the wall. Forgive us, Father, and her hands would still. You ever think forgiveness works both ways? She asked. How do you mean? Maybe the people here weren't just asking to be forgiven for what they did to him, she said softly. Maybe they were asking him to forgive them for losing their faith after he was gone. Samuel nodded slowly. Maybe that's what the bell's trying to say. The sun dipped behind the trees, staining the sky gold and ash. Sarah packed her gloves, brushing dust from her coat. Tomorrow, I'll bring lantern oil, she said. If we light this place again, maybe others will come. As she walked down the path, Ranger trotted to the doorway and stared after her until she disappeared into the mist. Samuel stood beside him, gazing at the bell tower that had once gone silent for half a century. He whispered, Maybe it's time the truth rings louder than the lies. The dog gave a low bark, tail wagging once. Samuel looked at the altar where the Bible had been found. For the first time, he noticed faint scratches on the floorboards near it, marks of something once pried open, then sealed again. He crouched, fingers tracing the edges. Tomorrow, he said to Ranger, we dig. Outside, the wind rose, brushing against the cracked wood like a sigh, and somewhere far down the valley, a single distant sound echoed, the ghost of a bell, reminding the living what silence had cost them. The storm came without warning, snow falling thick and fast, wind bending the trees like old men at prayer. Inside the church, the walls moaned under the weight of winter, but the fire Samuel had built glowed warm in the hearth he'd repaired from an old tin drum. Ranger lay close to it, fur glistening with melted snow, eyes fixed on the flicker of light. Outside, the hill was nothing but white silence, broken only by the hum of the wind pressing against the glassless windows. Samuel sat at the wooden table he had built from broken pews, oil lamp steady beside him. The pages of Father Michael's Bible were spread open, the note still tucked inside. He was writing in his own notebook, recording what Clara had told him that morning. The story of greed, betrayal, and the silence that had followed. His handwriting was neat but heavy, each word deliberate, as if the act of writing was a small kind of prayer. From time to time, he looked at Ranger, who had begun to shift uneasily, nose twitching. The dog's ears pricked forward toward the altar. "What is it, boy?" Samuel asked, setting down his pencil. Ranger stood, tail stiff, and gave a low growl that wasn't fear, more a warning. He padded to the front of the church, stopped at the altar, and began to scratch at the floorboards. Samuel frowned. "Ranger, hey, stop that." But the dog wouldn't. His claws scraped the wood with a desperate rhythm, his body tense, eyes glowing in the firelight. It wasn't random. He was digging. Samuel rose and crossed the aisle, snow crunching under his boots where it had blown in through the broken door. He knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his back. "You've got something there, don't you?" The boards were cold beneath his palm, colder than the air. He tapped it lightly, hollow. Grabbing his small crowbar, Samuel wedged it between the planks. They resisted at first, then gave with a brittle groan. Beneath them lay a shallow layer of packed earth, darker than the soil around it. He dug carefully with his hands until his fingers struck metal. The object was small, a rusted iron box about the size of a loaf of bread. Its surface was corroded but intact, sealed with an old latch. Samuel lifted it gently, brushing off the dirt. Ranger sniffed it once, then sat back, whining softly. The latch gave after a few careful strikes. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth now brittle with age, lay two things: a small brass seal engraved with the words Willow Creek Relief Fund, and a leather-bound book, the journal. Samuel's hands trembled as he opened it. The first page was dated March 9th, 1972. The handwriting was fine, almost elegant, though hurried in places. The council's figures do not add up. I have prayed for restraint, but truth demands its own voice. Samuel turned the pages slowly, each entry peeling back years of silence. Father Michael had recorded everything: names, amounts, letters sent, and the growing fear that surrounded him. "They came to me again today," one entry read. "Said the poor must learn patience. I told them patience does not fill a widow's table." Another, written days later: "The sheriff warned me this morning. He said truth doesn't feed men like power does. If I disappear, let it be known I died defending what little light this town had left." The last entry, dated 3 days before his disappearance, was shorter. The ink had bled, as if written with shaking hands. "If anyone finds this, let them know. The gold was never spent. It is buried where only faith would dare to look. Do not use it for revenge. Use it to rebuild trust. Use it to heal what greed has broken." The final line trailed into a faint signature: Father Michael O'Donnell. Samuel stared at the page, feeling the pulse in his throat. Ranger pressed closer, resting his head against Samuel's hand as if to anchor him. "You found it, boy," Samuel whispered. "You found the truth." He set the book aside and lifted the oil lamp to look deeper into the box. Beneath the journal lay a smaller pouch, heavy. He untied it, and a dull glimmer met the light. Gold coins, worn but unmistakably real, stamped with old relief marks. There weren't many, maybe enough to rebuild a roof or a town's conscience. Samuel leaned back on his heels, overwhelmed. After all this time, his voice cracked with a mix of awe and sorrow. A gust of wind forced its way through the broken window, blowing out the lamp. For a moment, only the firelight remained, dancing across the journal's open pages. Samuel sat there in the glow, holding the brass seal in one hand and the old pouch in the other. The door creaked open behind him. He turned sharply, heart thudding, but it was Sarah Whitmore, wrapped in a heavy gray cloak, her cheeks red from the cold. "You left the lantern burning by the road," she said, stepping inside. "I thought you might need—" She stopped when she saw the open floor, the box, the book in Samuel's lap. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is that—" "His journal," Samuel said quietly. "And the gold, the real fund, just like he wrote." She came closer, crouching beside him. The light caught her eyes, hazel, touched with disbelief. "All these years, people thought he stole it." "I know." Samuel turned the book so she could read the last page. She traced the words with her gloved fingers, her lips moving silently over the final sentence. After a long silence, she said, "Then the bell wasn't a haunting. It was a calling." He nodded. "A call to finish what he started." Ranger gave a soft bark, tail sweeping the floor. Sarah smiled faintly, resting her hand on his head. "He seems to know, doesn't he?" "He always does," Samuel said. Snow battered the windows harder now, as if the storm itself were listening. They sat together by the open floor, the gold gleaming faintly between them. "What will you do with it?" Sarah asked. Samuel looked at the coins, then at the church around them, the broken benches, the cracked altar, the walls that had held their breath for 50 years. "What he asked," he said finally, "we'll rebuild. Not just the church, everything it stood for." Sarah exhaled, her voice soft as the falling snow. "You'll need help." "I was hoping you'd say that." Outside, thunder rolled faintly, muffled by the storm. But inside, the air seemed lighter. The fire popped, sending sparks like small stars toward the rafters. Samuel closed the journal carefully and placed it back into the box. He whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years. Not for forgiveness this time, but for guidance. Ranger, exhausted from his digging, lay down beside the altar, eyes half closed. Samuel reached over and stroked his fur. "You did good, partner." The dog lifted his head, resting it on Samuel's knee, his eyes calm and knowing. Together they sat in silence as snow piled against the doors, the wind howling like a choir returning to life. Somewhere deep in the steeple above, a faint vibration hummed through the wood, a whisper of metal against air. Not a full bell tone, but enough to remind them that faith, once buried, never truly dies. Snow fell like ash that evening, soft but relentless, blurring the line between earth and sky. The rebuilt portion of the old church on Willow Hill stood proud against the cold, a fragile symbol of hope stitched together by rough timber, faith, and exhaustion. Inside, Samuel Hayes sat by the altar with the newly restored Bible resting open beside him, his hands still marked with dust and splinters. Ranger lay nearby, head on his paws, chest rising and falling, with the calm rhythm of a sentry who trusted his post. Over the past week, the small miracle of the church's revival had spread through Willow Creek. Word of the discovery, Father Michael's journal, the hidden gold, and the truth, long buried, had traveled faster than Samuel expected. Some villagers came to help repair the roof. Others left food or candles at the door, whispering thanks as they went. For the first time in 50 years, the path up to the church was lined with footprints instead of weeds. But not everyone saw redemption in the light returning to the hill. At the far end of town, Mayor Dale Carson sat alone in his office, the lamplight cutting sharp lines across his broad face. He was in his mid-40s, tall but heavy-set, the sort of man who had inherited both power and paranoia. His short graying hair was slicked back, his square jaw shadowed by a day's neglect. A gold ring, the same design once worn by his grandfather, former Councilman Harold Carson, gleamed on his finger as he turned it anxiously. Across from him stood Ray Dobson, his driver and errand man. Ray was younger, lean, with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, a souvenir from a youth spent running liquor across county lines. He had loyalty the way a stray dog had hunger, fierce, conditional, and dangerous when cornered. "You sure about this?" Ray asked, his voice low. "It's just an old church." Dale leaned forward, his knuckles whitening against the desk. "That church holds the journal, the gold, the proof. If that man keeps digging, my family name burns with it. You think the press will care that it happened 50 years ago? They'll run it like it's today." Ray hesitated, glancing toward the frosted window. "You want it gone?" "I want it forgotten," Dale said flatly. "Tonight." By the time the sun fell, the wind had begun to rise again. Samuel was finishing repairs to the side wall when Sarah Whitmore arrived, her breath visible in the cold. She wore a dark wool coat and a knitted blue scarf, her auburn hair pinned up neatly but damp with snow. She looked both strong and tired, the kind of woman who carried other people's burdens without complaint. "I brought soup and blankets," she said, setting the basket on the bench. "Half the town's talking about what you found." Samuel smiled, his voice quiet. "I figured as much." "They say Father Michael's spirit finally rested," Sarah continued, her tone soft. "That maybe the bell ringing was his way of saying thank you." "Or a warning," Samuel murmured. She frowned slightly. "Warning? Truth doesn't sit easy with those who built their comfort on lies," he said. "Some folks might not want this story told." Before she could answer, Ranger's head lifted sharply. His ears pointed toward the north window. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Samuel followed his gaze. Nothing but swirling snow and darkness. "Coyotes?" Sarah whispered. "Maybe," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd learned long ago to trust Ranger's instincts over his own. They shared dinner by the fire, Sarah telling stories about the town's first settlers, families who had come with nothing but hymn books and hope. The church had been their anchor through harsh winters and wars. "It's funny," she said, stirring her soup, "how people lose faith in walls before they lose it in God." Samuel looked toward the altar. "Walls can rot," he said. "Faith doesn't unless we let it." Hours later, after Sarah left to return to the inn, Samuel and Ranger settled near the fire. Snow beat against the windows in restless waves. The hill outside glowed faintly under the moonlight. Then, through the storm's hum, Ranger barked, once, twice, sharp and urgent. Samuel jumped to his feet. "What is it, boy?" The dog darted to the door, whining, claws scraping the floor. And then Samuel saw it. A faint orange reflection flickering across the window pane. Flames. He burst outside into the freezing air. The eastern side of the church was already alight, flames climbing up the wooden wall like hands of the damned. The wind fed it greedily, hurling sparks into the snow. The smell of burning pine and tar choked the air. "Ranger, stay!" Samuel shouted, grabbing a bucket near the well. He hurled water against the fire, but it hissed uselessly against the heat. The blaze roared higher, alive, devouring everything it touched. From the road below, shadows moved, 3 figures in heavy coats, retreating toward the darkness. Samuel saw one glance back. Even through the haze, the man's walk was deliberate, his shoulders too square to be a laborer. Dale Carson. "Coward," Samuel muttered, coughing through the smoke. Ranger darted past him, barking furiously. "No!" Samuel shouted, but the dog was already inside, disappearing into the smoke-choked doorway. The roof groaned, beams cracking under the strain. Samuel lunged after him, the heat searing his face. "Ranger!" he shouted, his voice tearing through the roar. Then, through the smoke, he saw movement. Ranger dragging something small and charred toward the door. The iron box, the same one they had found beneath the altar. Samuel dropped to his knees, scooping up the box and the dog at once. The fire howled behind them as he stumbled out into the snow. Flames reached through the shattered windows, painting the white hill red. He collapsed a few yards away, clutching Ranger to his chest. The dog whined softly, his fur singed, but his eyes clear. Samuel pressed his forehead against Ranger's and whispered, "You stubborn old soldier." When dawn broke, Willow Creek awoke to the sight of smoke curling over the hill. Word spread faster than the fire had. By mid-morning, people began walking the path. Farmers, widows, shopkeepers, veterans with limp hands and heavier hearts. None spoke. Each carried something, buckets of water, wood, bread wrapped in cloth. Clara Jenkins came first, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes shining with both grief and resolve. "We've waited 50 years, she said quietly, not waiting any longer. Behind her came Sarah, leading a group of children with small hammers and nails. She looked at Samuel standing among the ashes, soot streaked across his face. "You told me some truths can't be buried," she said softly. "Guess they can't be burned either." Samuel nodded, his voice hoarse. "They can burn the walls, Sarah, but not the truth." He turned to the crowd gathering on the slope. For a moment, no one moved. Then Clara stepped forward and placed a loaf of bread on the ruined steps. Another man set down a plank of wood. A young widow added her scarf to keep the wind off Ranger. One by one, the townsfolk began to rebuild, without command, without sermon, without fear. By midday, the first frame of the new wall was standing. The ashes mixed with snow at their feet, black and white blending into gray, the color of forgiveness. Ranger limped to the church door and sat, watching the people work. His ears twitched as if listening for a bell that no longer existed. And for a brief second, carried by the wind, there came a soft metallic hum from the ruins above, the faint, trembling echo of a single chime. Samuel looked up at the sky, snow melting into his hair. Spring came late to Willow Creek that year, as if testing whether the town was ready for renewal. The snow melted in slow surrender, revealing the scarred earth beneath, blackened from fire, soft with thaw, waiting. On Willow Hill, the remains of the old church stood like a skeleton of memory, charred beams, cracked stone, and the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the air. But that morning, the hill was not empty. Samuel Hayes stood at the center of it all, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand. His beard had grown thicker, flecked with gray, and the lines around his eyes were deeper now, not from age alone, but from something weightier, something that came with bearing both loss and purpose. Ranger, his faithful German shepherd, lay at the base of the church steps, no longer ruins, but the beginnings of stairs rebuilt from fresh timber. The dog's fur gleamed in the pale sun, and he kept his amber eyes fixed on the people working around him, as if counting each soul that had returned to this place. What began as one man's labor had become the work of a town, farmers, widows, veterans, and children. Hands that once trembled with doubt now held tools, nails, brushes, and faith. The air was alive with sound, hammers striking wood, saws whispering through beams, laughter and effort mixing into something sacred. Every strike, every breath, every movement was a prayer, unspoken. Sarah Whitmore arrived early, as she always did. Her auburn hair was pinned loosely today, strands fallen across her cheeks in the gentle wind. She wore a denim work shirt under her coat, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, showing arms more used to carrying burdens than flowers. Her hands were calloused from weeks of helping rebuild, but her smile, when she greeted Samuel, still carried a quiet grace. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" she asked, setting down a basket of tools beside him. He smiled faintly. "I'll sleep when the roof holds." She gave him a look that was half amusement, half worry. "That's the third time you've said that." "Then I mean it 3 times more." Nearby, a man named Ben Holloway, the town's carpenter, was directing a few younger men in lifting new beams into place. Ben was in his 60s, tall but lean, with arms like ropes of sinew and a thick white beard that made him look both weathered and wise. His right leg dragged slightly, a limp from a sawmill accident long ago, but he moved with precision, like a conductor guiding an orchestra. "Steady now," he barked. "If that joint slips, you'll be chasing nails down the hill for an hour." The young men laughed, adjusting their grip. Ben turned to Samuel and tipped his hat. "You gave me a reason to dust off my tools, son. Thought I'd hung 'em up for good." "Seems they were waiting for the right job," Samuel said. Ben nodded, eyes twinkling. "The best wood's the kind that's already seen a storm." Down near the slope, Clara, Jenkins ladled hot vegetable soup into tin bowls for the workers. Her apron was dusted with flour, and her cheeks glowed from the fire she had built. Around her gathered the town's women and children, stirring pots, baking bread, and bringing water from the well. Even the smallest children joined in, painting the lower planks with broad, uneven strokes of white. The smell of stew, wood smoke, and wet pine filled the air, carrying a warmth that no sermon could match. As the sun climbed higher, the church began to take shape, not as it once was, but as it was meant to be. Its walls stood straighter, its roof beams locked tight with fresh iron nails. The townsfolk moved in rhythm, bound not by command, but by shared redemption. At noon, Samuel climbed the ladder to inspect the crossbeam. From there, he could see all of Willow Creek spread below, the narrow streets, the thawing river, the faint plumes of smoke from chimneys. It struck him how alive the town looked, how different from the silence he'd first walked into months ago. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "You were right, Father Michael. Truth rebuilds faster than lies ever could." A small bark drew his gaze downward. Ranger sat perfectly still beside the statue of a saint salvaged from the ruins, a marble figure of St. Francis, chipped but still smiling. The dog had made that spot his post every day, guarding tools, watching children, and lifting his head at every sound of laughter. More than once, the townsfolk had joked that he was the church's new keeper. By late afternoon, the light turned golden, the kind of light that makes every surface look like forgiveness. The final beam slid into place with a clean, ringing sound. Ben wiped his brow and called out, "That's it, boys! She's standing again!" Applause broke out across the hill, cheers echoing between the trees. Someone began to sing softly, an old hymn, the kind once whispered during hard times. One by one, voices joined in. No one had rehearsed, no one had planned, but it fit the rhythm of hammers and hearts. Sarah looked up at Samuel. "You know what's missing?" He smiled knowingly. "The bell." Ben stepped forward, a grin tugging at his beard. "About that," he said, motioning toward a wagon parked near the road. 2 men pulled away the tarp to reveal the old church bell, blackened by fire, cracked along one side, but unmistakably whole. "Found her half buried by the stream," Ben said proudly. "Guess she didn't want to stay quiet after all." They hauled the bell up the hill with ropes, the townsfolk pulling together, breath steaming in the chill air. Children ran ahead, shouting encouragement. When they reached the belfry, Samuel and Ben worked side by side, hoisting it into place. The sun dipped low, painting everything in shades of amber and grace. When the bell finally hung steady, silence fell. Everyone stood still, hands clasped, breaths held, eyes shining. Samuel gave Ranger a nod. "You ready, partner?" The dog barked once, sharp and bright. Samuel pulled the rope. The first sound was hesitant, a dull, trembling note that shivered through the metal. Then the next came clearer, stronger, fuller. The bell rang 3 times, each peal rolling across the valley, bouncing off the hills, carrying through every open window in Willow Creek. People wept openly, not from fear this time, but from the weight of release. Clara crossed herself, Sarah bowed her head, and Ben closed his eyes, mouthing silent thanks. Children laughed through their tears. Even the old men, those who remembered the scandal, the silence, the shame, stood straighter. Ranger lifted his muzzle to the sky and let out a long, soft howl, neither mournful nor fierce. Something between them, something sacred. Samuel watched the light fade behind the hills and whispered, "Faith doesn't live in words or walls. It lives in hands." And as twilight settled, Willow Hill glowed again, not with fire, but with life. Morning sunlight filtered through the half-finished stained glass windows, scattering soft colors across the wooden floor. The new church on Willow Hill stood proud now, its scent of pine and varnish still fresh, the air thick with the sound of hammers and laughter. It had been 3 months since the bell had rung again, and already Willow Creek was unrecognizable, no longer a ghost town of guilt and whispers, but a place alive with purpose. Samuel Hayes knelt near the altar, sleeves rolled up, carefully aligning floorboards for the last section of the nave. His hands, though calloused and scarred, moved with quiet precision. Behind him, Ranger watched from his usual post, his thick brown-black coat catching the morning light, his ears flicking at the distant chirp of robins. The German shepherd had aged, 6 now, but his eyes still burned with that steady, alert loyalty of a soldier who'd found peace but never forgot the war. Sarah Whitmore entered carrying a tray of coffee and bread. Her auburn hair was tied in a messy bun, and she wore her old denim coat dusted with sawdust. "You've been here since sunrise," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Samuel smiled without looking up. "Can't ask people to help rebuild faith and then take the morning off." "You sound like Father Michael," Sarah teased, kneeling beside him, "except with less Latin." "Latin wouldn't fix these floors." Ranger's head suddenly lifted. He stood, sniffing the air, then padded toward the corner near the altar, the same place where months ago they had found Father Michael's journal. He sniffed again, then began scratching lightly at the boards. Samuel frowned. "Not again, boy," he murmured, though the familiarity of the scene sent a shiver down his spine. Sarah tilted her head. "He's got that look." Indeed, Ranger's tail was stiff, his paws striking with intent. Samuel knelt and pressed his ear against the floor. There, the faint echo of hollow space beneath the wood. He grabbed a crowbar and worked the boards loose. Beneath them was not soil, but a patch of stone, faintly curved. He brushed the dirt aside, revealing a small, rusted latch set into the ground. Sarah caught her breath. "Is that a door?" "Looks like it." Samuel tugged, and the latch gave way with a low groan, releasing a gust of air that smelled of earth and age. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. "I'll get the lantern," Sarah said, and a moment later the two of them stood side by side, light flickering against the rough stone walls. Ranger followed, careful and silent. The passage wasn't long, barely 15 steps before it opened into a small chamber no larger than a stable. Inside were wooden crates wrapped in canvas, their corners stamped with faded marks of the Willow Creek Relief Fund. Samuel knelt, pried one open, and exhaled slowly. Gold coins, dull with age but unmistakable, glimmered faintly beneath the dust. Alongside them, bound in twine, were ledgers and envelopes filled with receipts and correspondence. Father Michael's handwriting appeared again on several of them, steady and precise even in the face of betrayal. Sarah whispered, "So it's true. He hid part of the gold." "He didn't hide it to keep it," Samuel said quietly. "He hid it to protect it, from men like Carson's grandfather." Ranger sniffed around the room, tail low but calm, as if he knew they had unearthed something more important than treasure. Later that afternoon, Samuel gathered the townsfolk in the churchyard. The spring breeze carried the smell of lilac from the valley. Clara Jenkins arrived with her gray shawl and steady gait. Ben Holloway leaned on his hammer. And even Mayor Dale Carson came, his face pale and tense, humility having replaced defiance since the fire. He had offered to resign weeks ago, but the town refused. Forgiveness, they said, should mean something too. Samuel stepped forward, the iron box beside him, and the ledger spread on a table. 50 years ago, he began, a man of faith risked everything to protect what was meant for the people, not for greed, but for good. We found what he left behind, not just gold, but records, letters, and proof that Father Michael O'Donnell told the truth. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some gasped, others bowed their heads. Samuel continued, his voice steady. But this isn't about reopening old wounds. It's about healing what was broken. Father Michael wrote that the gold was to rebuild trust, not walls, to feed, to teach, to mend. He looked at Clara. That's why we'll use it to build something new, a place for those who fought their own wars and never truly came home. Clara nodded slowly, her wrinkled hands clasped tight. A place for healing. Ben's deep voice rumbled from the back. And for learning. Kids need skills, not pity. Sarah added, and care, a clinic, a safe room, a light for anyone lost. The townspeople murmured their agreement. Samuel smiled, his eyes glinting in the sunlight. Then it's decided. The gold will fund 4 things: a PTSD center for veterans, a vocational school, a small medical clinic, and a scholarship for the children of this town. And it will bear one name, Father Michael's Hope. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then applause broke out, not loud, but pure. The kind that starts in one heart and spreads like light through glass. Dale Carson stepped forward, removing the gold ring that had once belonged to his grandfather. This belongs in the foundation's cornerstone, he said quietly. Let what was once shame become memory. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. That's the right place for it. Ranger barked once, as if sealing the moment. Children laughed, chasing him across the grass. Work began the very next day. The empty lot beside the church. It was cleared and foundations were marked. Ben designed the framework himself, with Sarah organizing volunteers and Clara overseeing donations. Samuel coordinated construction, though he refused any title. Caretaker was enough. Ranger remained ever present, watching every load of wood and every child who wandered too close to the scaffolding. Weeks passed. Spring ripened into early summer, and the center rose from the ground. Wide windows, an open hall, a bell carved into its wooden sign. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Samuel stood outside the completed building, his reflection faint in the glass. The walls glowed with the last light of day, the same hue as the church's restored bell when it caught the sun. Sarah joined him, wiping her hands on her apron. It's beautiful, she said. It's honest, he replied. And that's better. She looked up at him, her eyes warm. What will you call it? He smiled. We already did. He pointed to the carved letters above the doorway. Father Michael's Hope, for healing, for faith, for all. Behind them, the bell rang softly. Not the church bell this time, but a smaller one, newly forged from melted fragments of the original. A blend of what had burned and what had endured. Samuel turned to Ranger, who sat on the steps, tail thumping gently. Looks like we did it, boy. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching. The wind caught the scent of wildflowers drifting up from the valley. Somewhere, in the hush between the final rays of sunlight and the first shadows of evening, Samuel thought he heard a whisper. Not a voice, but a feeling, as though the earth itself exhaled in peace. He looked out over Willow Creek, no longer burdened by silence, but lifted by purpose. The people below moved through the streets with laughter, their lives mended not by sermons or gold, but by the courage to begin again. Samuel breathed deeply, his heart quiet, his faith steady. "The light was never gone," he murmured. "It was just waiting beneath the earth." The first light of spring crept over the valley, spilling gold through the mist that curled along the foothills. The church bell, now bright and whole again, swung in slow rhythm, its notes carrying over rooftops and rippling through the waking town. On Willow Hill, what had once been a ruin now gleamed in the dawn, white walls catching the sunlight, windows glowing like watercolor, and a garden blooming where ashes once lay. A year had passed since the night of the fire and the rediscovery of Father Michael's treasure. Willow Creek, once fractured and silent, now stirred with the sound of living, footsteps, laughter, hammering, and the low hum of purpose. The old church had become Willow Hill Community Haven, a place that was no longer about sermons or penance, but about healing and belonging. Children ran along the stone path that curved toward the front doors, their shoes kicking up petals from the tulips Sarah had planted last fall. Some of the children were from nearby farms, others were orphans or the sons and daughters of veterans who had come for treatment. Their laughter mingled with the chime of the bell, and the hill, for the first time in generations, felt alive. Samuel Hayes stood near the entrance, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn brown jacket. His beard had grown fuller but neatly trimmed, and the lines on his face, once carved deep with grief, now softened when he smiled. He watched as two teenage boys helped an elderly man lift a wooden crate of soil toward the new greenhouse. That man was Earl Patterson, a retired mechanic with steel-gray hair and a missing thumb from an accident decades ago. Earl had a rough voice but a gentle heart. He'd been one of the first veterans to join the center's therapy program, and now ran a small woodworking class for others. "Watch your backs, boys," Earl barked, but the pride in his tone betrayed him. "This old spine's seen worse, but I don't want to test it." The boys laughed and saluted him in mock respect, and Samuel couldn't help but grin. Inside the main hall, the smell of fresh bread mingled with cedar polish. The once broken pews had been transformed into benches that lined the walls, now used for meetings, meals, and music lessons. On the far side, sunlight poured through the stained glass window, depicting hands lifting a single golden bell, Sarah's design. Sarah Whitmore, now 38, stood by that window, helping a group of women arrange baskets of spring flowers for the morning's ceremony. Her auburn hair had grown longer and was loosely braided down her back, flecked with the same pollen dust that covered her palms. She was lean and tall, with an open, kind face that carried both intelligence and warmth. Though she smiled easily, there was a gravity in her eyes, a quiet understanding of suffering shaped by years caring for her late husband, a Marine who had never returned fully from war. When she saw Samuel through the glass, she waved, her cheeks flushed by the morning air. He returned the wave with a nod that said more than words. Ranger trotted up beside him, tail wagging lazily. His muzzle had begun to gray around the edges, but his posture remained proud, his amber eyes bright. Around his neck hung a simple brass tag, engraved with the Haven's crest, a bell and a cross intertwined. He paused by a small statue near the path, a bronze likeness of himself, seated tall and watchful on a stone pedestal. The inscription read, "He guarded not just a man, but the soul of a town." Children often placed flowers or sticks near it. Someone had even tied a blue ribbon around the statue's paw that morning. Samuel crouched beside the real ranger, scratching his neck. "You see that, partner? They made you famous." The dog leaned against him, eyes half closing, as if humbly accepting the honor. Soon, the townsfolk began arriving for the dedication of the Haven's new wing, a vocational hall and small clinics built with the last of Father Michael's gold. Ben Holloway, the white-bearded carpenter, led a group carrying the final crossbeam to install above the entrance. His limp slowed him, but never stopped him. Clara Jenkins followed, balancing a tray of coffee and biscuits despite her age. "You feed men before they start swinging hammers," she always said. Even Mayor Dale Carson was there, sleeves rolled, his once pristine demeanor replaced by genuine humility. He had traded his tailored suits for simple shirts and work gloves, his hair now flecked with silver. In the months since his public confession and apology, he had become an unexpected ally in the town's renewal, organizing permits, funding, and community events without seeking credit. The ceremony began simply. Sarah stood on the steps and read aloud the final passage from Father Michael's recovered journal, the same one that had been framed and hung near the altar. Her voice was clear and reverent. "If faith is a seed, let it be sown not in stone, but in the hands of those who mend. Let the weary find rest, and let truth ring louder than regret." When she finished, Samuel stepped forward. "We built this haven together," he said, voice strong yet low. "Not as a monument to what was lost, but as proof that forgiveness builds stronger walls than fear ever could. This isn't my work or Father Michael's legacy alone. It's ours. Every nail, every stone, every moment of doubt turned to hope. It belongs to all of Willow Creek." A quiet hush settled. Then someone began to clap. Soon the entire crowd joined in, filling the air with a thunder of hands. The bell overhead rang again, 3 clean notes echoing across the valley. Ranger barked once, tail sweeping proudly. After the ceremony, people lingered. Some veterans sat beneath the oak trees, sipping coffee while trading stories. Children painted the fence posts white. Sarah and Clara arranged a picnic table with bread, soup, and flowers. The laughter and smell of baking bread reached every corner of the hill. As afternoon deepened, Samuel walked along the path to the garden behind the haven. It was filled with wildflowers and small plaques bearing the names of those who had served, lost, or given to rebuild the town. He stopped at one engraved simply, "Father Michael O'Donnell, Shepherd of the Forgotten." Sarah joined him there, standing quietly. "He'd be proud," she said softly. Samuel nodded. "He already was. We just couldn't hear it then." They watched as the children ran past, chasing Ranger, who barked with joy despite his age. The sun dipped behind the hills, scattering light across the valley like a blessing. When dusk came, candles were lit all along the path to the haven. The bell rang one final time that day, long and low, its echo mingling with the murmur of wind through the grass. Samuel stood by the doorway, looking out at the glowing valley and the faces of those he once thought lost to despair. He turned to Sarah. "Do you think they'll remember all this 50 years from now?" She smiled, brushing a stray hair from her face. "If not, the bell will remind them." He chuckled softly. "And Ranger?" Her eyes sparkled. "He'll be guarding Heaven's Gate by then." Samuel looked down at the faithful dog resting by the steps, his tail curled around his paws, eyes calm and content. Then Heaven's in good hands. As night fell, the haven glowed like a lantern in the dark, a house not just of wood and stone, but of every prayer turned into action, every scar turned into purpose. And when the dawn came again the next day, the town of Willow Creek awoke to the sound of the bell, the laughter of its people, and the promise of light that would never fade. Years later, when the seasons had turned and the scars of Willow Hill had softened into legend, Samuel often sat on the porch of the haven as the sun rose over the valley. The church bell still rang every morning, steady, faithful, alive, and each note reminded him of what the town had become. The children who once played on the steps were now grown, some teaching at the very school they helped paint as kids. The veterans who came seeking healing had found purpose again, building, mentoring, planting. Even the land itself seemed to hum with peace. He would look at Ranger's statue, shining beneath the morning light, and smile. "You did good, boy," he would whisper. "We all did." The wind carried the faint scent of lilies from the garden, And in that stillness, it was easy to believe that some miracles don't roar from heaven. They grow quietly, in hands that refuse to give up. Because the true miracle of Willow Hill wasn't gold or even redemption. It was people learning to choose hope over bitterness, to build instead of curse, to love instead of fear. And maybe that's what God had wanted all along. Not grand gestures, but small mercies that rebuild the world one act at a time. So if you're watching this now, wherever you are, whatever hill you're climbing, remember this. Faith isn't about walls or sermons. It's about showing up when others won't, forgiving when it's hardest, and believing that even the coldest hearts can thaw in the light of kindness. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and the light to rebuild, no matter how dark the valley seems.